Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Design Cinema. This is Feng Zhu speaking, and we are actually at episode 88. Finally made it to 88, and it's been a long time, so let me take some time to explain why that is. I actually haven't been in country in Singapore. Well, I've been here teaching, but on the weekends I haven't been here. I've been traveling up into China for the past month and a half. As you guys know, or maybe you don't know, I have started a film production company up in Beijing, co-producing films with Chinese movie studios. So we've been quite busy currently working on several movies slated for 2019 release. Hopefully they'll be pretty cool, and you guys get to see what we've been working on when that time comes. So that's why I haven't been able to record a single episode, because all I do is I teach, and then I pretty much fly out up to Beijing, which is a 6-hour flight. I've been doing that every weekend, so it's been quite crazy. But I just came back. Actually, I literally just landed yesterday from Beijing. So I thought, hey, I have one day, pretty much 2 days free to get some recordings done. And I think hopefully this episode will be pretty neat, because it is actually my GDC presentation from earlier this year, GDC 2016. And the topic is going to be IP creation with design thinking. So my time is pretty short, so let's run in and just get this going. The main topic of this is, I think, aimed mostly for designers and artists who are already making something. IP stands for intellectual properties. So if you're designing for a game or a film, this will be a nice little checklist to go against, and you'll see what I mean as we start these slides. So all right, so let's just get started, man. So IP creation with design thinking. So I got my FCD Films logo up here now, Design Cinema, and of course FCD School of Design. So all right, let's jump in. First slide. So what are some problems when you don't have design thinking, right? So you just basically start drawing right away. Something that I think a lot of younger artists or inexperienced artists tend to do, which is, let's not plan too much, let's just draw. Now, there's a benefit to that, because you get to experiment with all sorts of fun stuff, but there's also a downside if you are working on a project that is burning money, right? Because when you're on your own, you can explore. Even as a student, you can kind of explore. But when you're on a project, depending on the deadline and how tight the designs should be and how fast you have to get it done, if you are tooling around and not really getting a design direction early on without design thinking, you could waste a lot of time. And here are some potential problems that could lead to, okay, which right underneath I've written a fast burn rate with no results. That's probably the biggest problem, which is money gets burnt really, really fast, especially if you run a studio. For example, right now you guys are doing a Kickstarter, or you're a small indie studio. You guys know exactly what I'm talking about, how fast that fund burns. Being a producer myself now as a film company, you're literally burning millions of dollars when you start a film, because these movies cost a lot of money. And where does all that money go? It goes to your teams, right, to your people. So from a design point of view, design department is really important. So let's point out some of these problems. So one, wasting time trying to find the design direction. Okay, so this guy's drawing this guy's drawing that, the art director is thinking of some other vision. Now, in the beginning days, everyone goes through this, right? We're all trying to find design direction. But if you narrow it down early, you can save a lot of time. So if you don't have a narrow and just trying to find it, right, quote unquote find it, well, you could potentially go for a month without finding design direction, because everyone's going everywhere. Okay, another one, great designs but no overall coherency. So concept artists, if you've been doing it for a while, everybody's good. Everyone could do good work in terms from an arts perspective or even design perspective. But if there's no direction, you have inconsistencies in design. Even though the designs themselves per piece might look nice, but put it together on the wall, it might not make sense for the IP. Okay, another one, spending a lot of resource on details rather than the bigger picture. So this I see a lot in studios. Basically, the art directors start to nitpick the small things. For example, let's make the grass look better, or let's fix the person's hair. Let's get the perspective to be like dead on and so forth, when the design hasn't even been found yet. And this wastes a lot of time, because everyone gets frustrated. The junior artists or even the designers thinking like, man, we don't even have a script yet. We don't even have our early beginnings of IP, and I'm already fixing grass blades, right? Total waste of time. Another one below that is a lack of strong art direction. resulting in a scattered art department, right? Another big problem that I run into a lot myself, working in the past so many years in studios, where you get concept artists who get frustrated because there's no direction. So after 6 months, they're like, you know what, this company sucks, man, because there's no one seems to know what they're doing. Art director is telling me one thing today, another thing tomorrow, and you know what, I'm gonna go to somewhere else. So you get a very scattered art department, and you actually might lose people after about a few months. They'll just quit on you because they themselves don't feel like this project is heading anywhere. All right, pretty big problem, especially in your like bigger the studio, sometimes the bigger the stuff occurs. Okay, last two. One is obscure or confusing design goals, no identity. This has to do with the coherency, but it's very similar, which is like there is no goal. Every day you go in and it's like, all right, well, what do I draw today? What do I draw tomorrow? What am I designing today? And you do that for a while, and it also gets quite tedious. And the last one, which is the most important, which is the money. Okay, and the wasted money here can result in what I call a coffin corner of design. Let me take a drink here. I'm speaking probably extremely fast because due to time. It's actually Wednesday today at 11 a.m. I try to get this wrapped up before noon, so sorry if I'm speaking extremely fast. So wasted money can result in coffin corner. What does that mean? So coffin corner in airplane terms, for those of you guys fly airplanes, the planes fly about 35,000 feet up. It's actually a very dangerous altitude in which if you're going a little bit slower, you actually start to fall out because the air is so thin. But the benefit is that because the air is so thin, you use very little fuel when you're cruising at that altitude. But pilots call that a coffin corner because a little change in altitude or in speed, the plane will actually lose lift and stall. So that's what they call a coffin corner. Well, in design, it's similar because what happens is you get, say you're a Kickstarter and you get funded, let's say $1 million, and you start to explore designs and so forth, and you're 3 months in, 4 months in, now you're out at 200,000, burned out already, gone. At this point, you have to go forward. Even if you don't like the design, even if you don't like what's happening with the IP, you have to go forward because you are forced to. You don't have enough money to sustain this project for another 2-3 months if you don't go into production. And some studios get into the situation where they're forced to design something or go into production without actually being happy with the pre-production. And believe it or not, this happens to big studios, small studios, happens everywhere. So my goal today is to kind of almost point out some common sense type things that happen in design pipelines, and maybe you guys could take a look at what you're currently doing and see like, hey, here's some of the stuff we could potentially look into. All right, so let's go to the next slide here. So with design thinking, what does it do, right? How does it help you? Well, here are some things it reduces risks and establish design goals very early on, and that can save money, it saves time, and of course it relieves stress. So here are some of those bullet points. All right, so establish overall design direction very early on. Okay, so by maybe even a month in, the whole art department knows what we're doing, and that puts the art department on the same page. Right, it doesn't matter new people coming in, junior guys coming in, senior guys coming in, one guy's leaving, another guy coming back in. Everyone knows exactly where this IP is headed towards. It knows its design goals, it knows its mood, the overall styling, everything's established. And that gives a clear vision among the entire team, and not just the art department team. I'm talking about the entire teams. For example, on a film, you have producers, you have exec producers, you have business people, you have marketing guys, you have writers, the script guys, everybody. Programmers, if you're on a video game, for example. So the whole team within maybe a month or two knows where this project is going, and they know where they're going to dedicate their life to, especially on a game that could run for 4 to 5 years. You do this and everyone knows, okay, this is the project I want to work on. This is the thing that's going to be keeping me busy for the next few years, right? And another one helps with budget estimates and production schedules, right? Without a clear design direction, you may not even know how much this project will cost, especially on things like films where you have to budget pretty early on in order to green light the budget, the film itself. So when you have a clear direction, we could tell, okay, we need these scenes. They look pretty much like this. The design direction is that. We're going to light it this way. We're going to shoot it this way. Here's the estimated cost. Here's how much green screen we might use. Here's how much blue screen. So you notice I'm talking a lot about films because that's all I'm doing these days is film. So the green screen, blue screen stuff all comes in. And having good production paintings and design direction early on helps big time, trust me, big time in terms of planning budgets and not overrun later on. Last two, results in solid marketable designs. Right, this is something I'll talk about later as we get into the slides, which is basically designs that's not satisfying the artist. Right, sometimes you get like, we're all artists inside a little bit. We all want to draw our own stuff. But you got to think this is for the project. This is for the film or the game. It's not yours. It's for the client. So when you get it early on, you're already pitching towards the marketability of the product. And last one, the project has down the correct path, which is really important. All right, let's go to the next slides here. Sorry, again, I'm rushing really fast. I'm talking 100 miles an hour, so I'm in total producer mode right now. So I need to just go through this. All right, so before we start drawing anything, let's establish the bigger picture. Okay, I have a little quote on the bottom, which says, do you know the plot of the original Star Wars movies? I'm pretty sure most of you guys listening or watching right now knows the plot, but do you remember the exact design of the X-Wing cockpit layout? I'm pretty sure most of us don't, myself included. I've seen Star Wars, I have no idea how many times now, way too many to count here. But I cannot tell you exactly what the X-Wing fighter's cockpit looks like. Neither do I know Darth Vader's little rebreather thing. And I know he's got a triangle shape in front of his mask, but what's in it, I cannot recall. I think it's maybe vertical stripes, horizontal stripes, maybe 3 little circles. I don't know. Now, why do I point that out? Is because the bigger picture is what counts, especially on movies, right? And to a certain extent to games as well, but especially for movies, because you're talking about a slideshow that goes at 24 frames a second. It's a giant slideshow. And when the audience leaves, they leave with the story, they leave with the feeling, they leave with emotions. They're not leaving thinking, oh man, that little dot on Darth Vader, that's what made the film, That's not what moviegoers go to see, nor what they remember. Us designers, yeah, maybe we'll remember some of the cool stuff, like, oh man, that gun design was really cool. But for your general audience, they're not going to remember that. They're going to remember the story. So what does that lead to? Well, that leads to a bunch of things we'll get to in a second here. But let's talk about the budget, right? So the bigger picture. So let's establish the budget of the bigger picture, then I'll lead to the simplification of the IP, okay? So let's look at the budget. Know your budget and time. So on the left here, I have a lower budget, and on the right, we have a higher budget. So why is that important? Okay, again, especially for movies. Okay, games, it should apply mostly as well, but movies is a little bit different because you have sets, you have live action things. I'm talking about live action films here. Budgets really determine the path of your film. You could try to fight it, but it's going to be difficult. Or what I mean by fighting it is, okay, my budget is $10 million and I want to make this Avatar film. You could try, but most likely it's not going to look as good because Avatar costs $200 million and you have $10 million. You cannot make that type of movie. But surprisingly, studios do fall into that trap in which they are aiming for a very, very high-end level film or even a video game, but your budget is very low. Say you want to make Uncharted 4, but your budget is $10 million. You can't. I'm pretty sure Naughty Dog spent 50, maybe 70 million making that game, possibly more. You can't. And really, where does that money go? It goes into production values, right? Expensive things, which we'll talk about here. So let's talk about if you have a lower budget. Say you have a development budget of $5 million and you want to make a film or even $10 million. What does that do? What does that budget determine? Well, one, your game or film most likely is going to be dark. Okay, the palette, the mood is going to be silhouetted and it's going to be dark. Why? Because dark stuff saves money. You can hide mistakes. You can shoot stuff with silhouette. You don't have to have everything perfect. So it's going to be dark. Next one, destroyed, messy, and function over form. So the world's going to be post-apocalyptic. It could be zombie. It could be a messy world. And you will see this in films a lot. A lot of your first-time directors who are now famous, but when they were students, they tend to start this way. So you have things like Jaws, Duel, Piranha, right? James Cameron. Peter Jackson did a bunch of zombie films before he did The Lord of the Rings. It's very common. Why is that? Because there's no money. So when there's no money, you do zombie flicks, you do horror movies, you do nighttime scenes. So it's very cheap. You could probably do a film for $1 million, actually, if you do a zombie flick, because you can make all sorts of mistakes. You shoot in the dark. It doesn't really matter. Okay. So those two go hand in hand. Next one, use existing objects, locations. Don't try to build new sets. Don't design stuff that needs a lot of concept, right? For example, a space station is very expensive, but shooting in the streets of Hong Kong is much cheaper because it exists. So use existing things. Another one, ordinary materials. So instead of trying to, for example, on the movie Tron, they were experimenting with a lot of expensive things, a lot of expensive materials. But if you don't have the budget, you cannot make Tron suits. They're too expensive. So you're going to use materials that's been tested and proven, so you don't have to try new technologies. Next one, repeatable assets. Okay, think of using one set, and this applies to video games as well. A single set that could be used multiple times versus going to one set to another. Another one, simpler blocks, simpler forms, easier to make, easier for 3D artists, easier for practical guys to produce them. Next one, use practical proven solutions. on a lower budget film or a game, you don't need to try too many new techniques, because each time you try and it doesn't work, you could potentially burn the money. My advice to most of my clients is we could try that on the second film if this one makes money. Remember, I think a famous case would be the Matrix films. The first Matrix film, I believe, cost somewhere between $10 to $15 million to make, and of course, the second one, the budget went skyrocket into the hundreds of millions, and you can see the difference in the films in terms of stuff they're trying, the technologies. They took bullet time to a whole other level in the second two Matrix films, and that's a very good example. And I think you also see it, for example, from the first Lord of the Rings film by Peter Jackson, which wasn't super well funded, and then to the Hobbit films, which was just insanely funded, and you'll see a difference there as well. Next one, use smaller teams, but they wear multiple hats. If you have lower budget, you have to hire people who could do multiple things versus having very, very specific job roles. On a big budget film, you can literally have one guy do one thing. Like that's the wardrobe, costume, fabric person, right? That's all they do is like look for fabric. But if you're on a smaller budget, that person has to probably design the clothes, go source it from the stores, and make it and oversee the department, everything, and probably put on the actors themselves. So one person does all of it. Why? Because you don't have enough budget to hire 10 people. So you have one person doing the job of 10. And last one, it's a shorter development cycle. This is a big one I point out to a lot of studios. Sometimes they want to do a pretty expansive film or game, but the time just doesn't allow it. Your budget will burn out before the time gets there. So you can't plan for a 3-4 year project if you only have $1 million. It's going to burn very quickly. So you have to plan almost backwards. And that's how we do a lot of our film budgeting, which is how much budget do you have? When do you want this film to come out? And we do it all in reverse. That determines how long we spend in pre-production, how long we spend on building sets and so forth. Okay. On the opposite, of course, is higher budget. And of course, it's the complete opposite. You can do all sorts of stuff. You can have a very bright palette. You can have bright moods. You can have clean designs. You can have new exotic locations. You can have expensive, hard-to-use materials. You have new assets for every single set. You have complex organic forms. You can use VFX for all sorts of stuff. And I just described the movie Avatar, which I think cost about $200 million. So, and that's why Avatar could do what they do. And same thing with the new Star Wars film, Force Awakens, right? It's all these things. You can have huge teams, large teams of specialization. So Avatar has Weta, and I think they have ILM. They have all these studios helping out the 3D and the VFX because they have the budget. And of course, you can have a longer dev cycle, typically in the 3 to 5 years. On a lower budget, you're running 1 to 2 years. All right, so that's about budget. Okay. The next one is, I think I'm actually missing a slide here. I'll try to put it back later, which is about the summary of the IP, which is a little strange. Let me double check here if I'm actually missing that slide. Oh, I actually am. Let me see if I could fit that in the next one. It's coming up. Oh, I got my slides a little mixed up, so sorry about that. But I don't want to re-record this thing due to time. So let's just keep going here. So who is your audience, right? The next slide here. Again, common sense, but sometimes the IP creators tend to forget or leave this out. Who are you designing this for? Is it a younger audience or is it a mature audience, right? Because they have different needs and your IP needs to go into different directions. So for example, and this is just an example. These are not everything. This is just a quick example of the differences. For example, if your audience is very young, they tend to like things that are a little flashier, very high detail. You could use exaggerations, and the entire IP is a roller coaster ride, right? So say like the recent Marvel films. A lot of them are wild rides. You go there, you sit down in your chair, and you're in a roller coaster for the next 90 minutes or 120 minutes. And you can have a lot of designs purely for fun. They don't have to have any deeper meanings or anything. They're just for fun. For your mature audience, well, you can have things that are functional, because your audience tend to understand how things work. So if you just make up a bunch of stuff, it tends to hard to sell. You have to have human stories. It could be relationships between parents and their kids. It could be relationships between a couple, for example. You can also develop your IP a little bit slower, a slower pace, to have dialogue explain the story versus everything is being action. You have a lot of cultural influences, and your designs can take on a deeper meaning that behind the designs there is another layer. For example, maybe like The Sixth Sense. Sean, what's that director's name? Can't remember. But the movie where the kid could see dead people. That that film has a lot of deeper meaning behind it. If you watch the behind the scenes DVD, the director tends to talk about these deeper meanings. For example, every time you see the color red, it is when a dead person is about to appear. So that's why Bruce Willis's door, I believe, was a red handle or a red door. He actually leaves through a red door. So the director is telling you he's already dead from the first shot of the film. But that's a deeper design that the audience might not pick up. All right, so let's go to the next slides here. So how serious is your IP is the next slide, right? Kind of related to your audience, but this is also important because sometimes we get scripts where we get game PDFs and we cannot figure out who this IP is for because they'll insert things that sometimes don't fit in a certain type of IP. Now, let me take another drink here. For example, is your IP very serious, right? Now I have examples here. For example, Private Ryan, Beasts of No Nation, right? And some games, for example, Life is Strange, Gone Home. These are pretty serious IPs, and you wouldn't tend to put in, for example, slipping a banana joke in a Private Ryan. Maybe, but it's pretty risky to put that kind of joke or a fart joke, for example, a fart joke in Private Ryan, because it doesn't fit the IP. The IP is going through a very serious tone. The audience walking away with a lot of emotional attachment to this IP. And when you put in like fart jokes or so forth, it doesn't fit. And surprisingly, these things do show up in scripts and so forth, where you're like, I thought this IP is kind of serious, and why is it like going this direction? So identify your IP in the early stage. There's entertainment, which is the IP is purely there to entertain you for the next hour or so. They're not super serious. They're a lot of fun. They don't take themselves super seriously as well. I mean, obviously they're taking themselves seriously, but they're there to entertain you. They're not to sell you an emotional roller coaster. For example, Private Ryan is emotional. Beast of No Nation is emotional. It gets deeper into you versus like Avatar. It's a great film. It's fun. It's right. But I think afterwards, you're not thinking that deeply into this movie. Neither is Skyrim or Metal Gear Solid. And of course, lastly, you got the lighthearted IPs, which are typically animations like your Zelda, your Nemos, and so forth. They're there to create joy. So when you walk away from this IP, you feel happy. You feel like you went on a different world and was just cheerful. And a lot of Japanese IPs tend to go to this world, like JRPGs, for example. They're very lighthearted and they're fun and they're entertaining, of course, but they're kind of there to uplift your emotions, your moods. So when you design these IPs, later on, you'll see why this is important. All right, so next slide got a little mixed up. This slide is actually supposed to follow that Star Wars quote I mentioned earlier, the one where I talked about you know the plot of Star Wars, but you don't know the details, right? So keep it simple. So sorry, the slide got a little bit out of sync here, but here's one thing you could do with your IPs, whether it's a game or a film. Can you summarize it within a single sentence or two? Okay, try to do it in one sentence. If you can do it in two, that's still good. If it takes you a whole paragraph or a whole page to summarize your IP, it is probably way too complex. So here are some examples I pulled from some major IPs. The first one is Robots from the Future, time travel to terminate human rebellion leader. And that pretty much describes your Terminator IP. Next one, young female archaeologist travels the world searching for lost tombs and killing bad guys. And that describes your Tomb Raider. Now, why is this so important? One, it keeps your IP very clean, so everyone can remember it. Two, you can check this IP against other IPs. If other IPs have similar description, that means your IP probably isn't unique enough yet, but yet it has to be simple. So this is where the hard stuff comes in. It's like you can't make it so difficult for the audience to understand by having a one paragraph description of your IP, but at the same time, it has to be simple enough yet not repeat what other people have done. So in the case of Tomb Raider, I think it's the only one. Like a young archaeologist travels the world searching for lost tombs. I think Tomb Raider is the only IP that fits it. So you could ask yourself the same thing for your own IP. Next one, epic space opera between forces of good and evil in a galaxy far, far away. That could only be Star Wars. The next one is a very famous IP and the only one that could fit it, which is the world we live in is actually a computer simulation created by robot slavers. Only could be Matrix. And look how simple this IP is in terms of its story, but look how much it has influenced the world in terms of nowadays there even scientists are talking about how Matrix could be the real thing. You know, we're all living in a Matrix. So it all come from a movie, it came from an entertainment IP, but very powerful in terms of its simplicity. Next one, time travel or traveling through time in a modified DeLorean car. Could only be Back to the Future. And last one, I put a little funny one, which is a bald-headed guy with a barcode tattoo goes around killing people, which is your blood, what is it called? I forgot this game called. Sorry, I forgot what it's called. My mind is completely zoning now. But Hitman, there we go. Too many IPs on my mind currently. Okay, so let's go to the actual IP design stuff. So here I'm going to go through about 8 slides, a bunch of hints of what you could do if you're designing for the IP. And I'm going to try to blast through this really fast because I'm watching the time here and it's already been 24 minutes. All right, so IPs generally involve conflicts, okay? And what we want to do is establish contrast. So first off, put your story on the wall, okay? Either a game or a film, get that script out and just spread it onto the wall. Find a big blank space on the wall. We have it at the studio as well. And just get the whole story arc down. And from there, you can identify your highs and your lows. Okay, that could be emotional highs, emotional lows. It could be a action high and action low. For example, you start the film with a cold opening, so it's explosions and so forth. They get a lot in the action films. And then you go into a low, then you go to the story in Act 2, and you go to a high, then you go to a low. So identify those points and start designing from there versus designing from zero, like the first part and the second, third, fourth. Why do we do this? Because we could create contrast, and later you'll see what that means. So if you have an emotional high in the beginning and a low later in Act 2, we could contrast those two designs in a variety of ways, which we'll get to in a second here. So this is just identifying the major scenes. On a film, we typically could pull out about 12 to 14, maybe up to 16 key moments that happens in the film, and that's exactly where we start the conceptual designs. We establish the entire arc with those 16 or so paintings, and that's all you need. And that could be accomplished with a very small art department, and right off the bat your entire team knows where the story is headed. It knows its color palette, design language, styling, and so forth. Okay, let's go next one. Character contrast, right? This is pretty simple stuff dealing with stories, but you have your antagonist, your protagonist, which is your good guy and a bad guy. Usually most of your IP starts with the bad guy in power, for example, Lord of the Rings or Mission Impossible and so forth. The bad guys sets the story in motion. Now, it doesn't have to be a person in particular. It could also be an event. For example, a earthquake or a weather system. For example, it turns really cold in New York. That could be your antagonist. And the hero, your protagonist, solves this situation. He needs to overcome whatever the bad guy is throwing at it, whether it's a tornado, like the Disney film, what's that film that's called the Good Hours or something, about the boat that breaks in half in sea, right? So in that case, the bad guy is the weather, is the ocean, and the good people have to overcome that. So in the middle, generally in Act 2, you have a confrontation. So why is this important? Because we're here to build contrast, and the next 6 slides will show what those contrasts are. Okay, so technology contrast. When you design this IP, are you using technology contrast? Who's using low tech? Who's using high tech? Who's using natural materials? Who's using man-made materials? And this is prevalent in a lot of IPs. And I've used Star Wars here as an example. The low-tech guys the weapons are used by the Jedis. The high-tech weapons are used by the Empire, right? And you notice the Jedis and all the good guys in Star Wars tend to use softer and natural materials. Their clothing also goes into warm color tones, whereas the bad guys go into this cold, black and white, hard material tone. It's a simple thing to do. All you gotta do is simple contrast that. But be surprised how many times I see errors where see things are just random. For example, I'll look at a concept design from an IP, and the art director is telling me, well, here's the good guy, here's the bad guy, and I can't tell the difference. The only way I could tell is because he told me, but otherwise I can't tell. Versus you look at a stormtrooper versus a Jedi, they're very distinct, not just in design, but the materials and the technologies they're actually using. So the audience will feel this. Okay, a lot of this stuff is felt. Remember earlier I was mentioning that audience will not remember the details. They're not going to remember the little notches on a lightsaber, but they're going to remember some persons called Jedis use swords and bad guys use guns. That's the idea we're trying to get at here, which is the contrast is quite heavy, so your audience can feel it. They're not designers. They're not going to know the little intricate details you put in. They're going to remember the bigger picture. Okay, so that's technology contrast. So think about how that applies to the IP you're currently on. Next, scale contrast, right? If you want to do something really tall, well, contrast it with something really short. If you want to do something really big, you contrast with something very small. You want something very narrow, contrast with something very wide. So let's put some examples. All of you read Lord of the Rings. All of you seen Lord of the Rings, the film. Where do we start in Lord of the Rings? We start in Hobbiton, right, where the hobbits live, and they're very short. Their area is very green, it's very lush, and it's very short. That's the whole Hobbit thing. They actually live underground. And where do they go at the very end? They go to a tower, Mount Doom, which is already on a volcano. On top of that, there's a high tower. So that creates a beautiful contrast between the hobbits and the end result of the IP, right? And another one, big and small. Let's talk about Zootopia. You have a little rabbit who's tiny, and then the boss, or even the fox himself. The fox is much bigger than the rabbit, and the rabbit's boss, which is this kind of not rhinoceros, I think it was a wildebeest looking animal, right? Huge animal, creates contrast. So this rabbit looked really, really tiny in the world of Zootopia. And I think that's exactly what Disney's aim was, that this tiny little character could solve a very big story, right? And that needs to have contrast. Notice Disney did not pair the rabbit with another rabbit, and the police captain is another rabbit, and everybody's all small. They did it on purpose to create contrast. And narrow and wide, you get that in games, for example, in Assassin's Creed. When you're on the street level, everything is very narrow. When you climb to the rooftop, everything opens up. So it creates contrast, and that's going to bring a memory, a feeling to your audience. Okay, next one, shape contrast. Another very common sense thing, but people tend to forget sometimes when designing. I tend to forget sometimes too. And these are slides generally there to remind us of don't forget the simple things in design. So for example, safe versus dangerous, right? There's many shape contrasts. I'm only using a very simple example of safe versus dangerous. Identify these keywords. What does it mean if you're designing a dangerous place? What are those key terms? Is it sharp things, crows, skulls, isolation, silhouette, fog, a hospital, right? Teeth, red, right? These are all things that generally for human beings means dangerous. What does it mean to be safe? Maybe a fireplace, soft materials, people talking and smiling, right? A sunny day, food on the table, a bedroom. These are things that are safe. So you can apply that. For example, you're creating a soft area, a safe area. Are you applying these type of common shape languages? Because these are things we identify with, right? And again, these are things I do see where I see a concept design. It's like, that's a safe place. I'm like, that looks pretty dangerous. Or this is a dangerous place. I go, that looks pretty safe. It's because it's sometimes the most common things gets left out. All right, next one, emotional contrast. So this gets a little bit deeper into design, but also very useful. I myself love this kind of stuff. I love putting deeper designs and emotions into my concepts, especially for film, for example. So I have a few examples here, words. For example, alive, right? What does it mean to design things that are alive? Well, you have, for example, growth, maybe sunlight, wind, okay, water, change of seasons, natural materials. When you have these elements, you tend to have a piece that feel alive. So for example, you're designing an inn. Maybe there's wind blowing through the windows, the curtains are moving, sunlight streaming through. There's a water fountain where people pouring water at the side. Outside, leaves are changing seasons. When you walk in, you already feel like this place is living. It is not a dead, desperate place, right? There's a little bit of dirt on the tables and so forth. So you feel like very organic, and that could give you a feeling of alive. And the next one's a little bit deeper now, hope. Okay, how do you design hope, meaning? So for example, reflection. You see a lot of films use reflection. I believe the recent Game of Thrones had a little reflection scene. What's that? The Stark girl looks into a mirror right before she poisons the other lady. So that's a reflection. You have spiritual, right? Could be gods, could be spirits. That could also hint at hope. So if your character later on is going to do something very, very grand, they could look in the mirror to get that reflection. They could do spiritual ways, basically signs of hope. You can also use shapes, for example, a path that leads upwards. So your hero, in the beginning, they could be a nobody, but they go upwards. They don't go downwards. So, for example, Skyrim, a video game, you start out and you go to, I believe, was it Whiterun or something? You go up this giant staircase, you open giant doors, which I mentioned here, large entrance. So it gives you this feeling of hope that you are the hero. You are going up. You are entering a big door. You are seeing infinity. These are all signs that give you a clue that you are the center of this IP, the story, right? Lead character. So other things I have here like discovery, how do you get discovery, which is also part of hope. A library. A lot of video games, RPGs have libraries in them because it gives you this kind of sense that you are moving forward, that you are solving things, which goes into hope. Last one here is despair, right? What does that mean? It could be heavy weights, solitude, you feel trapped, you feel pressure, feel lost, repetitive, and you see this on the Death Star in Star Wars. So how do you apply this, right, from the design? Because these are just photo reference photos. How do you use that? Well, you put these words down, and when you're designing, for example, I'm on a film in which you have to design a person who is under a lot of pressure. Okay, they're very stressed. So for his office, we made the ceilings very, very low and very repetitive. And these are keywords I used here. So when you step into his office, the audience naturally feel pressure because the roof is just like a little bit above where his head's at. And the audience might not know that we made that design decision. but hopefully they will feel it. They'll feel like, man, I feel trapped. I feel claustrophobic in his office. Why is that? Well, it's because we put the design elements in there for you to feel, okay? And that's what emotional contrast means. Next one here, lighting contrast, another common one, but if you want something to feel friendly, it could be from a war versus being scary. What does that mean? Well, generally, lights coming from above means a little bit more natural. Softer lighting, lights that are more ambient, for example, coming from above, and yellow in tone, warm, like sunlight, those all means nice and inviting. What is spooky, right? Lighting coming from the ground, long shadows, silhouette lighting, cold reflections, harsh shadows, like on the girl on the right there. These things tend to make us feel kind of creepy when the light's adjusted. Very simple, but very easy to apply, but sometimes gets forgotten when doing designs. Okay, it's a little bit of lighting contrast. And next is your mood and color contrast. So how do you use this one? Well, in the beginning, I mentioned the board with the storyline put on the wall there. What you could do is identify those 16 frames, those 18 frames or so, and start to apply a color contrast. So when you look on the wall, you could clearly tell where this film or game is headed in the different acts that it goes through. And here are a couple of examples. There's many ways to do this, but for example, there's complementary, which goes red, blue to red. So you start the film in the red, you put in the blue, and you end it in the red. Another example is a ramp up. You start in desaturated colors and you ramp into a certain color. Like I believe the Matrix is something like this one. And the last one here is RGB, which you use all three of your major colors in whatever combination you want. So here I have a blue, green, red combination. You can also use green, blue, red, or whatever it is combination. And you see the film Lord of the Rings use this combination, except they use green, which is the Hobbit, blue, which is Mount Mist, right, the Misty Mountains, and they end up finally in red, which is your Mount Doom. So why do we do this? Because it creates coherency. Remember all the stuff we talked about earlier. When you have all this stuff written down, your concept designers already know shapes, contrast, hope, feelings, right? And you also have color. So when they're designing Act 3, they tend to know exactly what Act 3 is. Maybe the scale is big, and the early Act 1 is small. The color is in the reds, whereas Act 1 is in the greens. So that way everyone's on the same page. All right, let's wrap this up pretty soon here. So the slides in terms of contrast is already wrapped up here. Here I'm actually talking about design balance. Now in my previous design cinemas, I've mentioned this before, but here's just a little refresher, which is if your IP is crazy, keep your crazy at about 10% and keep your 90% grounded, which is relatable humans, cultural references, everyday experience, grounded designs, real world reference, and don't confuse your audience, right? Very important. And again, I mentioned that in the previous GDC slides from 2015, I believe. You could check that out. Why do we mention this? Because when you have too much crazy, your audience will fall asleep, especially for films. If you have a crazy world, knock the stories down and make it a very simple thing. If you have crazy elements, contrast that with very grounded designs. On the bottom, I have some examples of that. For example, Persona, a Japanese IP, very crazy for those who know this IP. Basically, at midnight, you go into a different world and you're fighting monsters as school kids, right? So how do they ground this IP? If the entire game takes place in a monster world, it can get kind of boring after a while. So they contrast that by during the day, you're actually in a Japanese school, a very realistic school. There's no monsters, there's no craziness going on. You're going to school, you see the classrooms and so forth, and that's your 90% balance. Your 10% is going to the monster world. Same thing with Phantom Pain. This game just came out last year. The game looks like a 1980s, I can't say it, 1980s Soviet in Afghanistan, but they balanced that out. So that's your 90% grounded. And then, of course, Solid Snake himself, or I think that his name is Solid Snake, right? He's got some weird gadgets and so forth, and that's your 10%. Assassin's Creed, this IP, is 90% grounded. They only use existing cities. For example, London, Paris, where I was at Venice, right, Rome, and so forth. They use these areas, and that's 90%. And then your 10% is the dudes walking around stabbing people, right? So that's your 10%. Even bigger IPs like Aliens, which tends to look kind of crazy. But even Aliens, the alien himself or itself is about the 10% crazy, and 90% is actually quite grounded. Like the Space Marines are very, very Earth-like. They could relate to us. They don't talk very military. They talk like, kind of a ragtag Motley Crue type of Space Marines. That creates that groundedness that we could relate to. Back to the Future, the car, the world, all grounded except the fact that the car could go in the future. And even Star Wars, as crazy as it is, the world that is makes or it creates is very grounded. In fact, when we worked on Star Wars, I remember George clearly telling us, in the world of Star Wars, no planet is actually not Earth. So if you think about all the locations we go to in Star Wars, they're all on Earth. There are no crazy worlds. There is one that we snuck in slightly in episode 3, which I believe is called Fallujah, I think, which has all these weird planets. But other than that, every planet is grounded. Like, for example, your Tatooine, your Hoth, your Endor. In the new films, I don't know the planets' names, but they look like a forest planet, where Luke Skywalker was, or some Hawaiian island-looking place, right? They're very Earth-like. Why do we do that? It's because you don't want to lose the audience. Okay, let's wrap this up. And the last, almost final slide here is the visual hook. Now, I leave this last because we do deal with clients. Sometimes they jump on they look for artistic styling or a technology way too early. Focus on the IP first. Get your story down. Get your designs down. Get your IP stuff all down. Because if your IP is strong, the style can only help it. Because, for example, I have the Child of Light, I have Zelda, I have Persona again. These are very stylized IPs. But if you think about it, if they're taking in a different style, for example, Zelda was photoreal, the IP will still work. If Persona was photoreal, the IP will still work. So you don't have to focus too early. Now, the styling is very, very important because it identifies the kind of major direction for your IP. But get the story and those contrast points going first, and then we can explore style later. But it is important. It's not like we don't do this. But if the IP is strong, you could change the styling and it can still work. For example, Zelda has been made photoreal and it works. Zelda has been made very, very cartoony and it still works. Same with photorealism. An IP like The Exorcist, it'll probably work as an animated cartoon, right? It still works. Pirates of the Caribbean could probably work as an animated cartoon because the IP itself is quite strong. So sometimes we advise our clients, let's get the story down, let's get everything down, and then we start to spend maybe a month or so get the overall styling direction. And last one here is new technology. For us, of course, right now we're dealing with a lot of companies looking at VR and AR and so forth. And for us, though, as a design background, we still want to focus on really good designs and not get so gimmicky with the design, because sometimes clients jump too far into it. It's like, hey, let's make 360 everything 360 because it's VR. Well, you gotta plan this out. Yes, it's interesting, but are you losing the audience because everything is now a gimmick? So we tend to design it as if nothing's different. We're still designing real world things, locking the contrast down, getting the mood, the color, the lighting. But then we think, okay, how could we use VR? How could we use 180 or 360 on this scene? So we tend to develop it afterwards. Not sure if that's the correct way, but in my opinion, a strong design is a strong design, no matter how you shoot it or what kind of camera you're using to showcase it. So yeah, so that's the last thing. So last one I have here is an IP creation checklist. So I'll leave this up here for a little bit so you could kind of go through. If you are a designer now or you're part of an IP creation, maybe you could ask yourself some of these checklists. So let's go through real quick, which is, what is your time and budget? Is it big, long, a huge amount of budget, a long time, or small budget, short amount of time? So what is that? Identify that. Who's your audience? Young, old, mature, right? Super young. Who is it? Okay, how serious your IP is? Super serious like Private Ryan? Is it just purely for entertainment, or is it a very casual, uplifting thing like a Miyazaki film? The next one, what's your one-line summary? This is a pretty big one. Try to write that down. Okay, we get students that run into this. That's why they're students, right? They have IPs that are so complex. 2 minutes in, you're like, what in the world is going on? There'll be the IP like it's World War II and Britain is now spying on the US because they're aliens from another planet called Zonkor, and Zonkor actually established Earth in a matrix-like system, and you escape the matrix, go back in time and travel back and become a US CIA agent who then assassinates the British UFO guy to take over another planet. You're like, what in the world is going on? Too complex, okay? Simply World War II, good enough already. You could insert a little bit of crazy, that IP is already good enough. So next ones, do you have story contrast? Do you have technology contrast, shape contrast, lighting contrast, character contrast, scale contrast, emotional contrast, mood contrast, right? And last one, of course, what's the hook? And that's where the visual style comes in, right? Is it a cartoony thing? Is it a photoreal thing? Is it a VR thing? That could be a little hook there. So well, that's about it. And it looks like I wrapped it up under 45 minutes, which is not bad. So sorry if I talk super fast, and apologize for that little slide that's a little bit out of sync there. But hopefully you guys found this episode to be entertaining, and I'll try to record another one. I have no idea when, because I'm actually flying off again this weekend into Shanghai for the film festival. So sorry for the delay, guys, and I will see you in episode 89. This is Feng Zhu speaking, and see you later. Bye-bye.